So we've seen how to update the state using setState, but it's been under pretty contrived circumstances, using a timer to update it randomly with a new number every 1000 milliseconds. Not all that realistic. I mean, maybe you're building a clock or something, but most of the time when we're updating the state, or at least a lot of the time, it's in response to some sort of event. So something happens, a user clicks somewhere, they drag, they drop, they submit a form, they hit the spacebar or an enter key. And there's a lot more than just that. Maybe some page loads or something happens on the page. There's a lot of things that could occur. And we have a whole section coming up talking about React events. But here, I want to give you a preview so that we can start to do some basic things with state that are a little more realistic, things that amount to something more than just a timer randomly changing state. And to do that, we're going to learn how to do click events in React. So in React, every JSX element has these built-in attributes that we can use, and they represent all of the different browser events. So there's one for onClick, which conveniently is called onClick. So they're all camel-cased, lowercase o, uppercase c, single word, and we pass in a callback function that will be called when that element is clicked. So for example, here's a button, onClick, pass in inside of curly braces some JavaScript. So we pass in a function, and this function, all that it does is alert you clicked me. So when you click on that button, it will alert that. So we can test it out over here. I have a new button component, empty, just has a render method. Add in a return. We can return a button element that says click me, just like this. And then we'll pass in an onClick. So onClick, and we write some code. Now we can start by doing it inline. So we'll define a function right here. And this function is just going to alert clicked, like that. Now it's pretty rare to see the function actually written inline, but we're going to start there, and you'll see why in just a moment. So we have this button, it says click me, it says it alerts clicked when we click on it. We need to render one, so I've already imported it up here. So I'm just going to render a single button in my app. I'll head over here, and I have a button, I click it, and it alerts me clicked. Okay. That's easy enough. Now, usually we're not doing that, especially if we want to be setting the state, or if we want anything more than a single line of code, this is just not a good idea. So what we would normally do is define a separate function, a click handler, some function we call when onClick is triggered. All right, so I have a second component called broken click. You'll see why it's called that in just a moment. So I can just leave this one alone if you want to reference it for a code sample. But broken click, what I want to do here is have an H1 that displays whether the button has been clicked or not. And then if you click the button, it should update so the H1 displays clicked. Simple, but we'll use state to model that. So I'm going to start inside of I need to define my constructor. I've already written the basic skeleton for the component. It's called broken click. My standard props, I'm going to call super with props, not super mandatory in this case, at least the props isn't, because we're not using props in the constructor, but it's a good idea to put it there. And I'm going to set the state, or the initial state. I'm not using set state, but I'm defining it. We'll just add a single key value pair of clicked, and it will start as false. So clicked begins as false, and then inside of my render, since I'm going to have an H1 and a button, I need to put a div in there first, just like this, and this button will say click me, and then let's display an H1, and this H1 should either say clicked or not clicked, depending on what the state is. So we're going to add, instead of curly braces, we've seen this before, this .state.clicked, ternary operator, and if it has been clicked, we will say great, it's been clicked. Otherwise, we'll say not clicked. And let's be more enthusiastic. Let's do 3 exclamation points. So right now, this button doesn't do anything, but this should display not clicked because we started with the state clicked is false. Now I need to make sure I am actually rendering this component, which I'm not right now. So it's called broken click. I already imported it here. Now button does nothing, but it does display not clicked. Okay. So all we want to do is call a function when we click this button. So I'm going to define that function up here, and let's just call it handle click. And it's pretty standard for these to take an event object, so it could be EVT or E. We're not going to use it, but if you're not familiar with this, it's pretty standard across JavaScript in general, not just React. This will contain information about the event itself. but we don't care about it for now. Okay, so all we want to do is change state. So this dot set state, and what do we want to set it to? We want to update clicked to be true and save. So now we need to make sure we're actually calling this. So down here, we're going to add our onClick attribute and pass in that function. Now we can't just do handle click. We need to do this dot handle click. And that's the case for any of these instance methods we define. If I wanted to call handle click up here, if I just call handle click like this and save right now, you'll see that we get an error. It says handle click is not defined. Now if I do this dot handle click, we actually get a different error, but it's at least finding the function. Now it's just complaining because we're trying to call set state inside of the constructor, because this is setting the state in the constructor is not allowed. But that's a second issue. The main issue is that if we just call handle click, we don't have a valid function call. So we need to do this dot handle click. So down here, when I do on click, I need to pass in this dot handle click. And we want to make sure we're not actually executing that function. If we execute it, it will be run immediately. We want to just pass it in as a callback. Okay, so this says when we click this button, call this dot handle click, which is up here, and it should change our state so that clicked is true, which means this should display clicked because now the state has changed. However, when we click it, what do we get? Cannot read property set state of undefined. So that's telling us that this is undefined. It's trying to find set state, a method, on this, but this is not what we want it to be. That's why it's called broken click. So back to the slides. I have the exact code here if you want to check it out. This is back. So this is always back. The keyword this is a notorious troublemaker and the subject of way too many of my videos. It's just an annoying part of JavaScript you have to deal with. So this is undefined right now, and that's a problem. So let's think about it. Who is calling handle click for us? React is calling it on click. But what is it calling it on? It's not actually calling it on our specific instance of our button component or broken click component. So what happens is that the method is called out of context. It doesn't know where to look for it. It can't find that method. What we need to do is actually bind the function. So if you're not familiar with bind, I'll give you a quick rundown over here. What we're going to do is in the constructor, say that this dot handle click is equal to this dot handle click dot bind this. So if you don't write much JavaScript, this is just a horrible line to look at. If you do write a lot of JavaScript, you're probably used to this sort of code. What we're doing here is setting the context of handle click by binding this. The value of this inside the constructor is of the individual component. In our case, it's this broken click right here. And if we had 5 of them, each one would have their own this. And we're using .bind to set that context for handle click. So now JavaScript knows what this refers to down here. This is actually referring to our component, the individual component that we've created, and it's finding the handle click on that component. And it's setting state on the correct component, no longer is going to be out of context. So let's verify that it works, of course. Click, and now it changes to clicked. So it's only going to happen once because the way it's set up, every time it just continues to change to clicked. And I just want to reiterate this. If we open up the dev tools for React, we can ignore these warnings, all those components we're not using. Take a look. When I click, you will see this component update. It will be re-rendered. You can see that border appear. That means that it's being re-rendered because the state changed. One more time. So our solution to fix that whole problem was to bind our function, or our method, actually handle click, in the constructor to guarantee the value of this, so that down here we don't run into any issues. Now, as far as the actual binding itself, there is more than one way of doing this. So the way I just showed you was to bind it in the constructor, which I kind of like. I prefer it because it's explicit and you end up with all of your bindings at the top, so you can see all the methods that have been bound. Another option that you'll see is to use class properties, like we have here, where you use the fat arrow, and this will bind it for you. Another option that I really hate is to bind it directly in your render, inline in your JSX. I think it's really ugly and it ends up with a lot of cluttered markup, but this works, of course. It's the same idea. Also, you'll see people use an arrow function inside of render. I'm not really a fan of that as much. This is worse in my opinion, but again, this is all just opinionated stuff. All of these work, they're all on the documentation for React. There's a section that says, is it okay to use arrow functions in render methods? And it says, generally speaking, yes, it is. Anyway, we'll return to this when we talk more about events, because this is going to be a problem a lot of the time, pretty much all the time. So whatever method you choose, you'll end up doing it constantly. All right, so now that we have the basics done, where we can click and it's triggering a function, which is setting the state, we now can do a couple other things with that. So we're gonna do a quick exercise next, and then we're gonna have a slightly longer one after that. So next, we're gonna modify our random number generator thing to use a button.